Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to part 6 as we look at the third portion of Christianity, the Protestant Reformation. And so we left off with a brief biography of John Calvin, the French Protestant reformer. So now let's turn to some notable points with his theology. The first, and arguably the one he is most known for, the predestination of the saints, the doctrine of the elect. This is the teaching he is most known for, and probably the one he may be most criticized for, as there's no free will involved, no matter how you look at it. But to emphasize it, let me read here a portion from the opening of the first letter of Peter. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Bithynia, who have been chosen and destined by God the Father and sanctified by the Spirit to be obedient to Jesus Christ and to be sprinkled with his blood. May grace and peace be yours in abundance. Okay, here is essentially the theology regarding the predestination of the saints. Due to the disobedience, the sin, you could say, of Adam, the first man, Adam and Eve, both specifically first man, first woman, we have inherited a sinful nature. We cannot help but sin. But some have been chosen by God to break free of this. And these individuals are whom are known as the elect. So, to think of it another way, you don't choose God, God chooses you. If you are one of God's chosen, you are one of the elect. If you are not one of God's chosen, you are one of the damned. And there's nothing whatsoever you can do about it. Now, Calvin stated that the elect would be known by their fruits or by their works. But the scary portion with this teaching is that you don't know for certain. To give some examples of that, on the Catholic channel, as I call it, EWTN, I don't know if the show still airs. I think it does. But there was a show on there called The Journey Home that was moderated by Marcus Grodi. Marcus Grodi was a former Presbyterian minister. And might as well mention the journey home is essentially those who come into the Catholic Church, join the Catholic Church from either different Christian faiths or from non-Christian religions altogether. But anyway, Grodi was a former Presbyterian minister. The Presbyterian Church is part of the Calvinist tradition. And when I read his particular story of how he came into Catholicism, but he mentioned how when he was a Presbyterian minister, that there was a situation where someone from his congregation was dying, and he goes over to the house, and it was a married couple, and it was the husband, and the wife asks him, "Is my husband going to heaven?" And Grodi gave, because in the Presbyterian tradition, they don't have, a last rite sacrament like you have within Catholicism, Orthodoxy, or Anglicanism. But anyway, Grodi gave a fairly generic, answer about how, we must trust in the Lord, something like that. But he couldn't answer her with a yes because he thought of Calvin's teaching regarding the doctrine of the elect, that you don't know for certain. Calvin again stated that the elect would be known by their fruits or by their works, but you don't know for certain. And adding to that a little bit further, um, the pilgrims who are associated with the Thanksgiving story, their religion is what is known as Puritanism, and they come out of the Calvinist tradition. And if you read a lot of their literature, one of the things that they mention many times is they're often worried if they are one of the elect. And unless they have, you know, a vision of some kind telling them that they are, they don't know for certain. Continuing forward, another point: no religious images. For Calvin, religious images essentially, equaled or led to idolatry, which is a serious sin. And I mentioned earlier how Calvin was known for issuing fines in Geneva among those that would violate his teachings. If Calvin was walking around and happened to see that, you had, a little statue or portrait of either, Jesus Christ or the Virgin Mary, or, some images of cherubs or angels, something like that, Calvin would confiscate the image and issue you a fine for having them. Again, for him, religious images equal or led to idolatry. Now, Calvin was fine with images depicting the natural world. He was okay with that. There are statues of Calvin, for instance, and he was fine with things like that, just not religious images. From Calvin's perspective, the text, the Bible itself, would paint the picture. It would create the image. A criticism, however, of that particular point of view is that, there's reading and there's comprehending. And also, you do have to factor in, at least in the case, certainly with Calvin, that the only time really previously in church history that an issue regarding, his point of view on this, what's called iconoclasm, would have been back in the late 8th century. So, essentially you've had 700 years without an issue regarding, images, and Calvin himself would have been, affected by that. So even a lot of his mindset would have been by the images that he saw, growing up in church as a child. And, again, one of the things regarding religious images is that they sometimes serve, as a poor man's Bible, where the majority of Europe at this time, which could not read, the images would kind of paint the picture for them, would paint the text for them so they could see the images related to the text, and that would help them understand the text, in this case, the Bible. Another notable point would be no musical accompaniment in worship. Musical accompaniment in worship really would be more kind of like late 8th century, maybe 7th, but I think more 8th, with the advent of the organ, you know that it provided accompaniment to the worship ceremony. In the East, in the Orthodox Church, the worship services are generally a cappella, just the human voice. Although in the West, there are Orthodox services that do have musical accompaniment. It's not a doctrinal issue among those in the Orthodox Church. It's more of a disciplinarian issue. But with Calvin, for him, the worship service needs to be solely a cappella, just the human voice. Now, outside the church, if somebody wanted to sing along with the guitar or the lute or whatnot, that's fine. Calvin didn't care about that. But in the church, it needs to be solely just a cappella, just the human voice. And one other notable point. If one believes Christ to be present in the Eucharist or the Holy Communion, then Christ is present. If one believes that the Eucharist, the Holy Communion, is just a symbol, then it's just a symbol. This was Calvin trying to find a moderate ground, a middle ground between the points of view of Luther and Ulrich Zwingli regarding the Eucharist. I don't really focus on Zwingli much, I just mentioned him in passing. But Luther held that it's fundamental that you believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Now, how you choose to do so is up to you. If you want to hold the official position of the Catholics, transubstantiation, that's fine. Or if you want to have a different understanding of how Christ is present in the Eucharist, what can be called consubstantiation, that's okay too. It's just fundamental that you believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, the Holy Communion. Whereas Zwingli, he held that the Eucharist is just a symbol and nothing more. Calvin tries to find a moderate view between the two, and essentially it's a form of individual relativity, where if you personally believe that Jesus is present in the Eucharist, then he is. But if you personally find that the Eucharist is just a symbol and nothing more, then it's just that. It's a symbol and nothing more. But neither side, in this case from Calvin, would necessarily, satisfy, I guess you could say, those that would hold to the real presence, the Catholics, the Orthodox, Lutherans, Anglicans. For them, they would say, well, you can believe that it's a symbol all you want, but once the presiding minister, the celebrant, recites the words of Christ from the Last Supper, this is my body, this is my blood, then Christ is truly present. You can believe it's symbolic all you want, but he's there when those words are uttered. Whereas, from Zwingli's point of view, he would say, well, you can believe that Christ is really present, but they're just symbols and nothing more. So, anyway, I think that we will pause here and then next portion, we will get into Protestantism in England, the Protestant Reformation in England with Henry VIII. So take care. I will symbolically see you then.